Alright, right now I want to talk about the circular flow diagram. Now this isn't a major model that we're going to spend a ton of time with in this course, but but it is useful for several different things. First, it's going to convey the basic point that you can measure the size of the economy by either the total amount of expenditures that occur in the economy, or alternatively by the total amount of income generated by the economy. And the two should be exactly the same. The other thing it does is it's quite useful at explaining how how households and firms are interrelated with each other. And we're going to come back and use it to explain the intuition behind some things like the expenditure multiplier and things like that later on in the course. So I thought I'd go ahead and introduce it now, and we'll also play around with it a little bit after this basic introduction. Now I'm going to start off with a very, very simplified circular flow diagram in which there's only going to be two entities. Really, there's households over here, which I'll label with an H, and firms over here, which I'll go ahead and label with an F. So there are only going to be the two types of agents in the economy. We're not going to have a government, so I don't have to worry about taxes or government spending, and we're going to pretend like this is a circular flow diagram for the entire world, so we don't have exports and imports. Technically speaking, if this was a circular flow diagram for the United States, Canada, or some other country, we'd have to allow for the possibility that households might spend on imported goods, or that firms might produce exports. But we're going to simplify that away, because that's really just unnecessary complication. Right, now, households and firms are going to interact in two important markets. The first is going to be down here, which is the market for goods and services, and the second is going to be up here, and this is the factor market. Okay. Now, the market for goods and services is pretty intuitive to most people. That's where people like you go to buy gas, food, clothing. Your parents go to get houses, things like that. So anything that households normally buy, they're going to buy in the market for goods and services. Okay. So that's fairly intuitive because we're all used to being consumers and buying stuff. Might be a little bit less intuitive to you is factor markets. Now, factor markets really are it's just a fancy way of saying that's where firms go to hire land, labor, and capital. Okay, that's it. So you can think about it as one giant labor market for the entire United States or for the entire world, or one giant market where firms go to, build or have rent factories or purchase land or hire workers or something along those lines. Okay. Now the important thing is all factors of production are ultimately owned by some household out there in the economy. That's going to be an important point for later on. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. It makes sense that you own your labor services. You can choose to work or not. No one can force you. So you own your labor services. But you might say, well, doesn't, say, for example, Banana Republic or Ford own their stores and their factories? And the answer is yes, they do. Banana Republic owns its stores. You go into the mall, Banana Republic owns that store. If you go to a Ford factory someplace in Michigan or the South, they do own that factory. But the key point is ultimately that firm is owned by some household. And if you think about it, some of you might have a family business. You own the family business. Any profits that get generated from that family business go back to your family. The same thing is true of Ford or Banana Republic. Any profits they get ultimately go back to the owners of Banana Republic or Ford. Well, who owns Banana Republic and Ford? The people who own stock in them. Okay, so ultimately, any profits that get generated or payments to the owners of Ford or Banana Republic or other firms go to some household out there in the economy. Okay, now we can imagine just a simple situation where some household goes out and they spend $100. And it could be on anything. But the important point is $100 worth of spending. And we'll say it's $100 worth of spending on a shirt for Banana Republic. Okay? Well, that's going to be $100 worth of revenue for Banana Republic. Okay? Now, so Banana Republic can do one of several things with this revenue. They can go ahead and say, well, I'm going to go ahead and replace the shirt that was just bought, which means they're going to have to hire a worker to go ahead and produce it. So that's going to be $100 worth of payments. Okay? So they're going to hire a worker to replace the shirt, Or maybe they use that $100 worth of revenue to pay the owners of the firm. So somebody owns Banana Republic, so maybe it's going to be payments to them. Somebody owns Ford, so it's going to be payments to them. It doesn't really matter what they do with it, because that $100 worth of payments is ultimately going to go to some household as income. Okay? And here is a couple of the points that I wanted to make. First, you see the interrelationship. Spending by household is revenue for firms, which ultimately generates income for some household out there in the economy. So the decision of one household to either spend or not spend affects the income of other households in the economy. Okay? So that's an important point. We're all interrelated in the economy. The second important point is, if you wanted to measure the total amount of economic activity that's occurring here, well, then you can either go to the market for goods and services and see, oh, there's $100 worth of spending that's occurring in the market for goods and services. That's the size of the economy. Or alternatively, you could say, oh, there's $100 worth of income generated in the factor markets, therefore the size of the economy is $100. Okay? Both of those are equally valid. The other thing you should notice is, hey, the total amount of spending is the total amount of income generated. That's not an accident. Because of the interrelationship between households and firms, spending is going to equal income. Okay, so this is going to be a basic point we're going to come back to repeatedly over the course of the semester. And really, to me, spending is income. There's no real difference between the two. So you might hear me from time to time talk about total spending or total income in the economy. For me, they're more or less exactly the same thing. And they also happen to equal the total amount of production that occurs in the economy. So for a macroeconomist, income, production, spending, it's all going to be exactly the same thing. All right, well, that's the end of this first little video on the circular flow. Next time, we'll go ahead and make things a little bit more complicated.